Why they shut down California's deadliest prison, the story of San Quentin's end. The last sunrise. The sun doesn't announce itself at San Quentin State Prison. It doesn't burst over the hills with hope or promise. It crawls, slow, reluctant, like it knows what waits below. By 5:47 a.m., the first sliver of orange light touches the tops of the cell blocks, ancient concrete towers that have stood since 1852, longer than almost any other prison in the western United States. The walls are pale yellow in some places, gray in others, stained by more than a century of salt air blowing in from the San Francisco Bay. Up close, they look soft, porous, but they've held more than 1 million men, and they've buried hundreds. Inside, the air is different. It doesn't move the way it should. It sits heavy, thick with sweat and rust and something older, something that has no name, but every man who spent time here knows the smell. It clings to your clothes. It gets in your hair. You taste it when you sleep. The cells are small, 6 feet by 9 feet, a steel bunk bolted to the wall, a stainless steel toilet with no seat, a sink the size of a shoebox, and a man, always a man. Sometimes two, if the system is overcrowded, which it always is. At 5:50 a.m., the first tier wakes up, not because of an alarm, not because of a guard's voice, but because the man in cell 14 starts coughing. Deep, wet, violent coughs that echo down the metal walkway. Someone mutters for him to shut up. Someone else laughs. A toilet flushes. Then another. Then 6 more. The morning ritual has begun. By 6 a.m., the lights flicker on. Fluorescent, cold, unforgiving. They hum like insects. In some cells, men are already dressed. In others, they're still lying on their bunks, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks. There are 512 cracks in cell 29. The man who lived there for 9 years counted them all. Twice. Before we go any further, drop your location in the comments. It's how this community stays connected. If this kind of true story resonates with you, like the video, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who won't look at prisons the same way again. The guards don't rush. They've done this 1,000 times. They move with the kind of tired efficiency that comes from years of repetition. Keys jingle, boots scuff, radios crackle. One of them, Officer Mendoza, has been working North Block for 11 years. He knows which cells to watch, which men to avoid eye contact with, which mornings feel wrong before anything has even happened. Today feels wrong. He doesn't say it out loud. He doesn't need to. His partner, a younger officer named Collins, feels it too. The air is too quiet. The usual chatter is missing. When the cell doors start rolling open, one by one, slow and mechanical, the sound is louder than it should be. The men step out, but they don't talk. They don't joke. They move like shadows. San Quentin wasn't supposed to end like this. It wasn't supposed to end at all. For more than 170 years, it stood as California's flagship prison, the oldest, the most infamous, the most necessary, according to the state. It housed the worst of the worst, serial killers, gang leaders, cop killers, child predators. It held California's only death row. At its peak, it warehoused over 5,000 men in a facility built for fewer than 3,000. It was overcrowded, underfunded, and brutal. But it worked. At least, that's what the system told itself. But by the time the state announced its closure in 2023, San Quentin had become something else. A symbol, a warning, a place where the American criminal justice system's contradictions had grown so large they could no longer be ignored. The decision to shut it down didn't come from a single scandal. It came from the weight of 100 small failures, from decades of reports that were filed and forgotten, from lawsuits that dragged on for years, from men who died in their cells and were found 3 days later, from officers who quit after 6 months because they couldn't sleep anymore, from families who drove across the state every weekend to see their sons, their fathers, their brothers, and left feeling like they'd visited a graveyard. This is not a story about one man. It's not about one riot, one escape, one corrupt warden. It's about a system that tried to contain human beings in a space that was never designed for them. It's about what happens when punishment becomes the only language a society knows how to speak. And it's about the man who survived it. The architecture control. San Quentin was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to work. When the first prisoners arrived in July of 1852, they didn't walk into a prison. They walked onto a barge. The state of California, barely 2 years old, had no infrastructure, no courts, no jails. So they anchored a wooden ship called the Wobbin in the bay and stuffed it with 90 men. They called it a temporary solution. It lasted 4 years. By 1854, the prisoners themselves were forced to build a prison that would hold them. They hauled stone from the hills. They mixed mortar by hand. They laid the foundation of what would become one of the most notorious prisons in American history. Some of them were serving sentences for theft, some for murder. A few had been convicted of crimes that no longer exist, like being a nuisance to the public. The original cell blocks were modeled after the Auburn system, a New York prison designed that emphasized silence, isolation, and hard labor. The idea was simple: break a man down through routine, exhaust him through work, and rebuild him into a citizen. It didn't work. But that didn't stop the state from building more. By 1930, San Quentin had 5 major cell blocks: North Block, South Block, West Block, East Block, and the Adjustment Center, which was reserved for the most dangerous inmates and those on death row. Each block had its own culture, its own hierarchy, its own rules. North Block was the oldest, built in the 1920s. It had no ventilation, no natural light, and cells so narrow that a man couldn't stretch his arms out without touching both walls. It was reserved for long-term inmates, lifers, and men the state had given up on. The guards called it the shelf. Because once you went in, you didn't come back out. South Block was newer, built in the 1950s. It had slightly larger cells, better plumbing, and was supposed to house lower security inmates. But by the 1980s, overcrowding had erased any distinction. South Block held the same kind of men as North Block. They just had a little more space to hate each other in. West Block was where the noise lived. It was the most populated, the most volatile, the most prone to violence. Fights broke out every week. Stabbings every month. Guards avoided certain tiers, unless they had backup. Inmates ran their own economy: cigarettes, drugs, protection, debt. The state provided the cage. The inmates provided the order. East Block was the industrial wing. It housed the prison factory, the laundry, the metal shop, the furniture plant. Men worked 8-hour shifts making license plates, office furniture, and textiles for state. They were paid between 8 cents and 37 cents an hour. Some considered it a privilege. Others called it slavery with a badge. And then there was the Adjustment Center. The AC was different. It wasn't part of the general population. It was a prison within a prison. A concrete box with 96 cells, each one designed for a 23-hour lockdown. The men inside were considered too dangerous, too unpredictable, too politically radical to be allowed in the yard. Some were gang leaders. Some were cop killers. Some were on death row. And some were just men the administration didn't like. The AC was where George Jackson lived, where Hugo Pennell lived, where the black guerrilla family was born. It was where the line between political prisoner and common criminal blurred until it disappeared entirely. But the architecture wasn't the real structure of San Quentin. The real structure was invisible. It was built from fear, from power, from silence. It was built from the unspoken rules that governed every interaction, every glance, every word. You didn't talk to guards unless spoken to. You didn't ask questions. You didn't snitch. You didn't show weakness. You didn't look at another man too long. You didn't touch another man's food. You didn't sit in the wrong seat. You didn't walk through the wrong part of the yard. And if you broke one of those rules, the system didn't punish you. The other inmates did. San Quentin was a machine. It ran on routine. Every day was the same. Wake up, count, chow, work or yard, lockdown, count, chow, lockdown, count, sleep, repeat. The monotony was intentional. It was designed to numb you, to make you forget what year it was, to make time disappear. Some men served 20 years and couldn't remember a single day. Others could recount every hour of every week because that was the only way they stayed sane. But beneath the routine, there was always movement, always tension, always something waiting to break. By the time the prison reached the 2000s, it was falling apart, literally. The plumbing was over a century old. Sewage leaked into the cells. The electrical wiring sparked fires. The roof leaked. The walls cracked. Inmates slept in hallways and day rooms in makeshift beds because there weren't enough cells. The state knew. The courts knew. The public didn't care. Until COVID-19 hit. In the spring of 2020, the virus tore through San Quentin like wildfire. Within 6 weeks, more than 2,000 inmates tested positive. 28 men died. Guards got sick. Medical staff quit. The prison went into full lockdown. No visits. No programs. No yard time. Just cells. And silence. The outbreak wasn't an accident. It was a transfer. In late May, the state moved 121 inmates from a California institution for men in Chino, a prison with an active outbreak, directly into San Quentin. No testing, no quarantine, just a bus ride and a cell assignment. Within days, men started coughing. Within weeks, they were dying. The lawsuits came fast. So did the media. So did the protests. Families stood outside the gates with signs. Activists demanded release. Public health experts called it a human rights crisis. The governor promised reform. But San Quentin had been in crisis for decades. COVID just made it visible. And when the virus finally burned itself out, when the death toll stopped climbing, the state made a decision. Not because of compassion, not because of justice, but because the cost of keeping San Quentin open had finally exceeded the political cost of closing it. In March of 2023, Governor Gavin Newsom announced that San Quentin State Prison will be transformed into a rehabilitation center. Death row would be dismantled. The adjustment center would be emptied. The population would be reduced by more than half. The name would change. It sounded like progress. It sounded like reform. But to the men still inside, it sounded like something else. It sounded like the beginning of the end. The hierarchy of survival. Inside San Quentin, the state controlled the locks. But the inmates controlled everything else. Power didn't come from a title. It didn't come from a uniform. It came from respect, fear, and the ability to enforce consequences when respect wasn't enough. The hierarchy was invisible to outsiders, but to the men living inside, it was as rigid as the bars on their cells. At the top were the shot callers. These were the men who didn't need to raise their voices, who didn't need to fight, who could end a problem with a nod or a glance. They were usually lifers, men serving 25 to life, life without parole, or sitting on death row with appeals that would take decades. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain from stability. Because chaos was expensive, chaos drew attention. And attention meant lockdowns, shakedowns, and lost privileges. The shot callers were often tied to prison gangs. The Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla Family, Nuestra Familia. These weren't street gangs. They were organizations, structured, disciplined, built to survive not just years, but generations. Membership wasn't open. You didn't join by asking. You were invited, vetted, tested, and once you were in for life. Dropping out meant death. Not eventually, not metaphorically, literally. A dropout was a dead man walking. The only question was when. The gangs controlled the drug trade, the gambling, the debt collection, the contract violence. If you wanted protection, you paid. If you wanted contraband, you paid. If you owed money and couldn't pay, you became the payment. But the shot callers weren't just criminals. Some of them were scholars, readers, men who had spent decades in law libraries fighting their cases, men who taught younger inmates how to file appeals, how to read legal briefs, how to survive a system designed to bury them. They were respected not just for their violence, but for their intelligence. One tier below the shot callers were the enforcers. These were the men who carried out orders, the ones who didn't ask questions, who didn't hesitate, who understood that in a place like San Quentin, reputation was currency, and currency was survival. If a shot caller said someone needed to be handled, the enforcer handled it. Quietly, efficiently, without drama. Enforcers were usually younger, serving long sentences, but not life. Men in their 20s and 30s who still had enough fire in them to do what needed to be done. They were the ones who got into fights in the yard, who smuggled weapons, who delivered messages, who made sure debts were paid. But they also bore the consequences. Enforcers were the ones who got caught, the ones who got stabbed in retaliation, the ones who ended up in the hole, solitary confinement, for months at a time. And when they came out, they were expected to pick up right where they left off. Then there were the independents. These were men who didn't affiliate, who didn't run with a gang, who kept their heads down and did their time alone. Some were older, some were sex offenders, automatically excluded from gang protection. Some were just smart enough to know that joining meant becoming a piece on someone else's chessboard. Independents had to be careful. They couldn't appear weak, but they also couldn't appear threatening. They paid taxes, a percentage of their commissary, their drugs, their earnings, to whichever gang controlled their housing unit. In return, they were left alone. Mostly. But independence came with a cost. If something happened, if someone got robbed, if someone got jumped, the independents had no backup, no one to call, no one to retaliate on their behalf. They were on their own. At the very bottom were the outcasts, sex offenders, snitches, debtors who couldn't pay, men who broke the code in ways that couldn't be forgiven. These men lived in protective custody, separated from general population. They ate separately. They showered separately. They exercised in cages barely large enough to turn around in. Protective custody wasn't safety. It was exile. And even there, the violence found them. Guards didn't always care who ended up in a cell with who. Mistakes happened. Doors got left unlocked. And when a snitch ended up in a room with the man he testified against, the result was predictable. But the hierarchy wasn't just about gangs and violence. It was about code. The inmate code was unwritten, but everyone knew it. It had been passed down for generations, whispered in cells, taught in the yard, enforced with blood. Rule 1, don't snitch. Ever. For any reason. Cooperated with the police, the district attorney, or the prison administration was the worst offense a man could commit. It didn't matter if you were telling the truth. It didn't matter if you were trying to save yourself. If you talked, you were done, and your family wasn't safe either. Rule 2, mind your business. What you see in another man's cell is none of your concern. What you hear in the showers is none of your concern. What happens in the yard stays in the yard. Curiosity was dangerous. Questions were dangerous. The safest thing you could do was see nothing, hear nothing, and say nothing. Rule 3, pay your debts. If you borrowed, you paid back. With interest. Always. A man who welched on a debt wasn't just breaking a rule. He was challenging the entire structure. And the structure didn't negotiate. Rule 4, respect the shot callers. Even if you didn't like them. Even if you disagreed with them. Even if you thought they were wrong. Because disrespect was a challenge. And a challenge meant violence. Rule 5, never show weakness. Weakness invited predation. Men who cried were targets. Men who begged were targets. Men who flinched were targets. You could be terrified. You could be broken. You could be dying inside. But you never showed it. The guards knew the code. They knew the hierarchy. And most of them accepted it because it made their job easier. A controlled yard was a safe yard. If the shot callers kept the peace, the guards didn't have to. It was an unspoken agreement. The state provided the cage. The inmates provided the order. And as long as no one got killed on camera, everyone could pretend the system was working. But sometimes the agreement broke down. In the summer of 2015, a young inmate named Marcus Tillery arrived at San Quentin. He was 23 years old, first-time offender, sentenced to 8 years for armed robbery. He didn't know the rules. He didn't know the code. And he didn't know that the bunk he was assigned used to belong to a dropout from the Aryan Brotherhood. 3 weeks later, Marcus was found in his cell with a bedsheet around his neck. The official report listed it as suicide. The inmates knew better. No investigation was opened. No charges were filed. The guards wrote it up as a mental health incident. Marcus's mother demanded answers. The prison offered condolences. The case was closed. But inside, everyone knew what had happened. And everyone knew why. Because San Quentin wasn't governed by the law. It was governed by the code. And the code was absolute. The hierarchy wasn't just about gangs and violence. It extended to work assignments, cell placements, and access to resources. Men with long sentences and clean records could work in the kitchen. The kitchen meant extra food. Extra food meant currency. Currency meant power. Men with trade skills could work in the furniture plant or the metal shop. Those jobs paid slightly more than the standard 8 cents an hour. More importantly, they provided access to tools. Tools that could be stolen, sharpened, turned into weapons. Men with education could work in the law library or the education building. Those jobs offered something money couldn't buy. Access to information, legal precedents, case files, appeal strategies. For a lifer, information was worth more than drugs. But the most coveted jobs were the ones that provided mobility. Laundry workers, porters, maintenance crews. These men could move between buildings, between yards, between blocks. They could deliver messages, smuggle contraband, gather intelligence. They were the circulatory system of the prison's underground economy. And the underground economy was vast. Drugs flowed into San Quentin through every possible channel. Visitors smuggled them in. Guards smuggled them in. Drones dropped them over the walls. Inmates working outside details brought them back in their shoes, their waistbands, their body cavities. Heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, Suboxone, tobacco, all of it had value. All of it could be traded. A single cigarette could buy a debt extension. A gram of heroin could buy protection for a month. A steady supply could buy an entire cell block. The dealers weren't always gang members. Some were just enterprising men who saw an opportunity and took it, but they paid taxes. Always, because the gangs controlled distribution. And if you tried to operate without permission, you didn't operate for long. Cell phones were worth more than drugs. A working smartphone could cost thousands of dollars in commissary credit. It meant access to the outside world, calls that weren't recorded, messages that weren't read, connections that couldn't be traced. Some men used them to stay in touch with family. Others used them to run criminal operations from inside the walls. Drug deals, fraud schemes, hits. The line between inmate and free world criminal had become porous. The guards knew. The administration knew. But finding a phone in a prison with 5,000 inmates was like finding a needle in a stack of needles. Searches turned up dozens every year. But for every phone confiscated, 3 more made it in. And the phones weren't just tools. They were evidence that the walls didn't work anymore, that the idea of incarceration as separation from society was a fiction, because the men inside were still connected, still operating, still powerful, and in some cases, still more dangerous than they'd ever been on the streets. The guards who walked the line. The corrections officers at San Quentin weren't monsters. Most of them weren't heroes either. They were people doing a job that broke them slowly, in ways they didn't notice until it was too late. Starting salary for a correctional officer in California was just under $50,000 a year. After 5 years, with overtime, some made close to 90. For men and women from working-class backgrounds, it was a solid paycheck. Stable, union-protected, benefits, pension, but the cost wasn't measured in dollars. Officer Derek Howell started at San Quentin in 2009. He was 24 years old, former high school football player, no college degree. He'd worked construction for 3 years before applying to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The academy was 16 weeks. They taught him how to restrain an inmate, how to use a baton, how to call for backup, how to write a report. They didn't teach him how to sleep after watching a man get his throat cut in the chow hall. Derek's first week on the job, he was assigned to West Block, day shift, Population count was just over 1,200. The block was loud. Always. Voices echoing off concrete. Toilets flushing. Metal doors slamming. Radios crackling. It was sensory overload. He couldn't hear himself think. His training officer, a 15-year veteran named Sergeant Ramos, gave him one piece of advice. Don't try to be their friend. Don't try to fix them. Do your job and go home. Derek tried, but it wasn't that simple, because the inmates weren't a monolith. They weren't all predators. Some were kids, 18, 19 years old, sentenced to life for crimes they committed when they were still in high school. Some were old men, 60, 70 years old, men who had been inside so long they didn't remember what the world looked like anymore. Some were respectful, polite. They called him Officer Howell and thanked him when he delivered their mail. Others were hostile. They called him pig and bitch and worse. They threatened him. They tested him. They waited to see if he would flinch. Derek learned quickly that respect wasn't given. It was earned, and it had nothing to do with the badge. Inmates respected officers who were consistent, who followed the rules but didn't abuse them, who didn't play favorites, who didn't humiliate them in front of other inmates, who treated them like human beings, even when the system didn't. But they had no respect for officers who were afraid, who hesitated, who let inmates run over them. Fear was blood in the water, and once the inmates smelled it, they circled. Derek saw it happen to a rookie named Officer Callahan. Young guy, fresh out of the academy, soft-spoken, polite, too polite. Within a week, inmates were testing him, asking for extra privileges, ignoring his orders, talking back. Callahan didn't know how to push back without escalating, so he didn't push back at all. 3 weeks in, an inmate walked right past him during a count. Didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him, just kept walking. Callahan froze, didn't call it in, didn't report it, hoped no one noticed. Everyone noticed. Within a month, Callahan was reassigned. The official reason was scheduling needs. The real reason was that he'd lost control of his tier, and the administration knew it. If he stayed, someone was going to get hurt. Maybe him. Maybe an inmate. Maybe both. Derek made a decision that day. He wasn't going to be Callahan. He was going to be firm, fair, and untouchable. It worked. For a while. The hardest part of the job wasn't the danger. It was the repetition. Every day was the same. Wake up, drive to the prison, pass through 3 security checkpoints, change into your uniform, attend roll call, get your assignment, walk the tier, count, escort, monitor, break up arguments, write reports, count again, go home, and the next day, do it all over again. The monotony was numbing, but it was also a survival mechanism. Because if you started thinking too hard about where you were, about what you were doing, about the fact that you were spending 40 hours a week inside a cage with men who had nothing to lose, it became unbearable. So most officers didn't think. They just moved. But some days, you couldn't avoid it. Derek was working East Block when it happened. A lifer named Kenneth Braxton, 62 years old, served 41 years for a double murder he committed in 1978. Model inmate, quiet, kept to himself, worked in the library. No write-ups in over a decade. Kenneth had a parole hearing scheduled. His lawyer thought he had a real shot. The parole board was granting more lifers than ever before. Kenneth had taken every class the prison offered: anger management, victim impact, restorative justice. He'd written letters of apology to the families of the men he killed. He'd found religion. He'd done everything right. The board denied him, unanimously. No explanation, no path forward, just a stamped denial and a date for his next hearing in 5 years. Derek found Kenneth in his cell that night, sitting on his bunk, staring at the wall, not crying, not angry, just empty. "You all right, Braxton?" Derek asked. Kenneth didn't look at him. 41 years, Officer Howell. 41 years, and they still see me as the man I was when I was 21. Derek didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He just stood there for a moment, then moved on to the next cell, 3 days later, Kenneth was found hanging from a bedsheet tied to the air vent. Derek wrote the report. He testified at the inquest. He followed protocol. But he couldn't stop thinking about Kenneth's face. The emptiness in his eyes. The resignation. Kenneth wasn't the first suicide Derek had seen. He wasn't the last. But he was the one that stayed. Because Kenneth had done everything the system asked him to do. And it still wasn't enough. Not all officers were like Derek. Some were corrupt. Contraband didn't just walk into San Quentin. Someone brought it in. And while visitors and drones accounted for some of it, the bulk came through staff. Guards made $50,000 a year. Inmates offered $5,000 for a single delivery. The math was simple. In 2016, a correctional officer named Lieutenant Michael Cordova was arrested for smuggling cell phones and drugs into San Quentin. He'd been doing it for 2 years. Made over $100,000. He wasn't an anomaly. He was just the one who got caught. The operation was simple. An inmate's associate on the outside would contact Cordova. They'd arrange a drop location, a gas station, a parking lot, a park. Cordova would pick up the package. The next day, he'd bring it to work. He'd pass it to a trustee. The trustee would distribute it. Cordova would get paid through a third party. No direct contact. No paper trail. It worked until a rival gang snitched. Not to the police. To the prison administration. Because Cordova wasn't just bringing in contraband. He was bringing it in for one gang and not the others. And that disrupted the balance. The administration had known for months. But they didn't act until the gangs forced their hand. Because as long as the contraband flowed evenly, it kept the peace. But once it became a monopoly, it became a problem. Cordova was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. He served 18 months. When he got out, he moved to Arizona and never spoke about San Quentin again. But he wasn't alone. Between 2010 and 2020, more than 40 correction staff at San Quentin were arrested, fired, or resigned under investigation for smuggling, bribery, sexual misconduct, or excessive force. Some of them were desperate, drowning in debt, struggling with addiction, trying to support families on a salary that barely covered rent in the Bay Area. Others were just greedy, and some have been corrupted slowly, over years, by the proximity to power and violence. They started by bending small rules, looking the other way, accepting a favor, and before they knew it, they were in too deep to get out. Then there were the officers who used their power to hurt. In 2018, an inmate named Rashad Miller filed a complaint alleging that Officer Vincent Torres had beaten him during a cell search. Rashad was in administrative segregation, solitary confinement, for a fight in the yard. He was cuffed, on his knees. According to his complaint, Torres kicked him in the ribs, punched him in the face, and called him a racial slur. Torres denied it. His partner, Officer Lang, backed him up, said Rashad was combative, said he resisted, said the force was justified. There were no cameras in the cell, no independent witnesses, just 2 officers and 1 inmate. The complaint was dismissed. 3 months later, another inmate filed a similar complaint against Torres. Then another. By the time an internal investigation was opened, there were 7 complaints on file, all from inmates in ADSEG, all involving excessive force, all dismissed due to lack of evidence. The investigation found no conclusive proof of misconduct. Torres was cleared. He remained on duty, but the inmates knew, and so did the other guards. Torres wasn't just violent. He was untouchable, because the system protected him, because the union protected him, because juries didn't believe inmates. And without video evidence, it was always going to be an officer's word against a convict's. So Torres kept working, kept hurting people, kept getting away with it, until one day he didn't. In 2020, during the COVID lockdown, Torres was caught on a contraband cell phone video beating an inmate in the shower. The video was grainy, shaky, but it was clear enough. The inmate leaked it to a civil rights attorney. The attorney leaked it to the press. The press ran the story. The union couldn't protect him anymore. Torres was fired, charged with assault under color of authority. He pled guilty. Sentenced to 16 months. Served 8. When he got out, he moved to Texas. The inmates he hurt are still inside. But for every officer like Torres, there were a dozen like Derek, men and women who showed up every day and tried to do the job without losing themselves. They went home and didn't talk about work. They kissed their kids and pretended they hadn't just spent 8 hours in a place where hope went to die. They drank too much. They slept too little. They saw things they couldn't unsee. And they came back the next day because the bills had to be paid, because the pension was too close to walk away from, because they didn't know how to do anything else. Derek Howell lasted 7 years at San Quentin. In 2016, he transferred to a lower security facility in Central California. Less money, longer commute, but quieter, safer. He never went back to San Quentin, not even to visit. When asked why he left, he didn't talk about the violence. He didn't talk about the corruption. He talked about Kenneth Braxton. "I couldn't stop thinking," Derek said years later in an interview with a local journalist, "that we were asking men to change, to grow, to become better. And then we were punishing them for the rest of their lives for who they used to be. And I didn't know how to be part of that anymore." He paused. "I still don't." The breaking point. San Quentin didn't collapse all at once. It crumbled in pieces, over decades, until the weight of its failures became too heavy to ignore. The first crack appeared in the 1970s. George Jackson was 29 years old when he was shot and killed by guards in the San Quentin yard on August 21st, 1971. Official reports said he was attempting an armed escape. Witnesses said he was executed. The truth disappeared somewhere between the two. Jackson had been inside since he was 18. Convicted of stealing $70 from a gas station. Sentenced to 1 year to life under California's indeterminate sentencing law. He served 11 years. Not because of the robbery, but because he kept fighting back. In prison, Jackson became a revolutionary. He read Marx, Engels, Fanon. He wrote letters that became books. He co-founded the Black Guerrilla Family, a prison gang with a political ideology rooted in anti-capitalism and black liberation. He became a symbol, not just to inmates, but to activists, intellectuals, and radicals around the world. The state called him a criminal. His supporters called him a political prisoner. Jackson's death triggered riots across the country. At San Quentin, the tension was suffocating. Inmates refused to work. Guards doubled their shifts. The administration locked down entire blocks for weeks at a time. But the Rayol explosion came 2 weeks later. At Attica, on September 9, 1971, inmates at Attica Correctional Facility in New York took control of the prison. They held 42 staff members hostage. They demanded better living conditions, fair wages, and an end to racial discrimination. They negotiated for 4 days. On September 13th, Governor Nelson Rockefeller ordered state police to retake the prison by force. They stormed the yard with tear gas, shotguns, and rifles. When the smoke cleared, 29 inmates and 10 hostages were dead, all of them killed by police gunfire. News of Attica reached San Quentin within hours. The inmates didn't riot, but they didn't need to. The message was clear. The system would rather kill them than listen to them. And the system proved them right. By the 1980s, the war on drugs had filled San Quentin beyond capacity. The population doubled, then tripled. Cells built for one man held 2. Gyms were converted into dormitories. Hallways became sleeping quarters. Violence became routine. Stabbings happened weekly. Race riots erupted every few months. The Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family fought for control of the drug trade. The Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia fought each other over territory and principle. The guards couldn't control it. They stopped trying. Their job became damage control. Count the living. Remove the dead. Write the reports. Move on. In 1984, a riot broke out in the South Block dining hall. It started as an argument between 2 inmates over a stolen radio. Within minutes, it became a full-scale battle between the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family. 40 men were involved. Sharpened metal. Homemade knives. Locks stuffed into socks swung like medieval weapons. The guards didn't intervene. They sealed the doors and waited. By the time the riot burned itself out, 6 men were dead. 17 more were hospitalized. The administration called it a contained incident. The inmates called it Tuesday. The dead were identified. Their families were notified. Their bodies were shipped home or buried in the prison cemetery just outside the walls. No charges were filed. No one was held accountable, because accountability required proof, and proof required witnesses. And in San Quentin, no one saw anything. The 1990s brought a new kind of violence: institutional neglect. By 1995, San Quentin's medical system was so overwhelmed that men were dying from treatable illnesses. Diabetes went unmanaged. Infections went untreated. Cancer diagnoses came too late. In 1998, an inmate named Daryl Mitchell collapsed in a cell. He'd been complaining of chest pain for 3 days. Medical staff told him it was indigestion, gave him antacids, sent him back to his cell. He died of a heart attack at 2:47 a.m. He was 41 years old. His family sued. The case took 4 years. They won. The state paid a settlement of $1.2 million. No one was disciplined. No policies changed. Daryl wasn't alone. Between 1995 and 2005, more than 200 inmates died at San Quentin from preventable or treatable medical conditions. The prison had 1 full-time doctor for a population of 5,000. Medical appointments were scheduled months in advance. Emergency requests were ignored. In 2005, a federal judge ruled that California's prison medical system constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The state was ordered to overhaul the entire system. It took 15 years, billions of dollars, and men kept dying. Then came the executions. San Quentin was the only prison in California authorized to carry out the death penalty. The gas chamber, built in 1938, had been used to execute 196 men and 4 women. In 1996, California switched to lethal injection. The gas chamber was retired. A new execution chamber was built, but the execution slowed, then stopped. The last execution at San Quentin took place on January 17, 2006. Clarence Ray Allen, 76 years old, legally blind, in a wheelchair, suffering from diabetes and heart disease. He was executed for murders committed in 1980. Protesters gathered outside the gates. Families of the victims watched from a viewing room. The execution took 12 minutes. Allen was pronounced dead at 12:38 a.m. After that, nothing. California's death penalty became paralyzed by legal challenges, pharmaceutical shortages, and shifting public opinion. By 2023, there were 699 men and women on death row at San Quentin. None of them had been executed in 17 years. They lived in a state of perpetual limbo, waiting for an execution that might never come, waiting for an appeal that might never succeed, waiting to die of old age in a cell built for killing. The crisis reached its peak in the 2010s. In 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that California's prison overcrowding constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The state was ordered to reduce its prison population by tens of thousands. San Quentin was at 200% capacity. The state responded by transferring inmates to county jails, releasing low-level offenders early, and implementing realignment policies that shifted responsibility from state prisons to local jurisdictions. But San Quentin's population barely dropped, because the men inside were lifers, long-termers, men convicted of violent crimes, men the state couldn't release and didn't know what to do with, so they stayed, and the conditions worsened. In 2016, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of inmates in the adjustment center. The lawsuit alleged that conditions in the AC constituted torture. Men were locked in their cells for 23 hours a day. No sunlight, no fresh air, no human contact. Some had been in solitary confinement for over 20 years. The case dragged on for years. Expert testimony described severe psychological damage, depression, hallucinations, suicidal ideation. Some men talked to walls. Some stopped talking altogether. In 2020, the state agreed to a settlement. The adjustment center would be closed. Death row would be redesigned. Inmates in long-term solitary would be moved to less restrictive housing. But implementation was slow. By 2023, men were still living in the AC, still in solitary, still waiting. And then COVID-19 arrived. The outbreak at San Quentin wasn't just a public health crisis. It was a moral reckoning. Within weeks, the virus spread to every cell block. Inmates slept 6 feet apart in open dormitories. They shared sinks, toilets, showers. Social distancing was impossible. Masks were scarce. Hand sanitizer was banned because it contained alcohol. Men begged for help. They wrote letters. They filed emergency petitions. They banged on cell doors. They went on hunger strikes. The response was slow, inconsistent, inadequate. Medical staff were overwhelmed. Guards called in sick. Programs shut down. Visits stopped. The prison went silent. And men started dying. 67-year-old Richard Garcia, serving life for a murder he committed in 1985. He tested positive on June 8, 2020, dead by June 15th. 59-year-old John Reed, death row. He tested positive on June 12th, dead by June 22nd. 71-year-old Orlando Romero, lifer, tested positive June 18th, dead by June 28th. The names kept coming. The death toll climbed. Families couldn't visit, couldn't say goodbye, couldn't hold funerals. The state called it unavoidable. Activists called it negligent homicide. Inmates called it execution by virus. By the time the outbreak was contained, 28 men were dead, thousands more were infected, and the world had finally seen what people inside had been saying for decades. San Quentin was a death trap. In March 2023, Governor Gavin Newsom stood in front of the cameras and announced the end of San Quentin State Prison as the world knew it. The facility would be reimagined, renamed, transformed into the San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. Death row would be dismantled. The population would be cut in half. The focus would shift from punishment to rehabilitation. It sounded like progress. It sounded like justice. But to the men still inside, it sounded hollow, because the same walls would still stand. The same cells would still lock. The same guards would still walk the tiers. The name would change. The mission statement would change. But the reality? The reality was harder to transform. The men who remained. When the announcement came, the men inside San Quentin didn't celebrate. They didn't hope. They'd learned a long time ago that promises from the state were just words on paper. But a few believed, or wanted to believe, that maybe this time would be different. Marcus Hall had been inside San Quentin for 32 years. He was 54 years old, sentenced to life without parole for a murder he committed when he was 22. He didn't deny it, didn't make excuses. He'd spent 3 decades living with what he'd done. In that time, Marcus had changed. He'd earned his GED, then an associate's degree through a correspondence program. He'd completed every rehabilitation program the prison offered: anger management, victim impact, restorative justice, substance abuse counseling. He'd mentored younger inmates, taught them how to read, how to write appeals, how to survive. Marcus had been on death row for 15 years before his sentence was commuted to life without parole. When he was moved to general population, he thought it was a second chance, a chance to live, even if it was behind bars. He became a facilitator for the Victim Offender Education Group. Every week, he sat in a circle with other lifers and talked about the harm they'd caused, the lives they'd taken, the families they'd destroyed. It was brutal, honest, and necessary. For Marcus, it was the only way he could make sense of still being alive. When news broke about San Quentin's transformation, Marcus was cautious. He'd seen reforms before. New programs, new policies, new wardens with new ideas. They all faded. The system always returned to what it knew: punishment, control, warehousing. But this felt different. The governor had used the word rehabilitation 18 times in his speech. He'd talked about dignity, about humanity, about recognizing that people could change. Marcus wanted to believe it, but belief was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not everyone inside wanted change. Tommy Vega had been at San Quentin for 41 years. He was 63 years old, a shot caller for the Mexican mafia. He'd spent more of his life inside than out. He didn't remember what freedom felt like. Didn't want to. San Quentin was his world. He knew every guard, every tier, every corner of the yard. He had power here. Respect. Order. The idea of turning San Quentin into a rehabilitation center didn't just threaten the structure. It threatened his identity. Because if the prison changed, if the population was cut in half, if the old ways were dismantled, where did that leave men like Tommy? He wasn't stupid. He understood what the state was doing. They were going to transfer the violent offenders, the gang leaders, the lifers who would never get out. They'd be sent to Pelican Bay, to Corcoran, to the supermax facilities designed to bury men alive. San Quentin would become a showpiece, a symbol of California's commitment to criminal justice reform, and the men who made it what was would be erased. Tommy didn't fight it. He didn't protest. He just watched and waited because he knew something the state didn't. You couldn't change a prison by changing its name. The violence was in the walls. It was in the men, and the men weren't going anywhere. James Caldwell was different. He was 28 years old. He'd been inside for 6 years. Sentenced to 12 for armed robbery. He wasn't a lifer. He wasn't a gang member. He was just a kid who made a terrible choice and was paying for it. James had stayed clean. No write-ups. No fights. He worked in the kitchen, took classes, wrote letters to his daughter every week. She was 4 when he went in. She was 10 now. She barely remembered him. When he heard about the rehabilitation center, James felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe this was his chance. Maybe if he kept his head down, kept working, kept proving he'd change, they'd see him as more than a number, more than a mistake. He signed up for every new program they offered. Vocational training, cognitive behavioral therapy, peer mentorship. He wanted to be ready, wanted to show them he was worth saving. But the waiting was unbearable, because hope is dangerous in prison. It makes you vulnerable. It makes you believe things might get better. And when they don't, the crash is devastating. James had seen it happen to other men, seen them get parole dates, only to have them revoked, seen them get transferred to better facilities, only to get sent back, seen them believe in the system, only to be crushed by it. He didn't want to be one of those men, but he didn't know how to stop hoping. The transfers started in late 2023. Inmates deemed too dangerous, too violent, or too influential were moved out first. Tommy Vega was on the list, so were most of the shot callers. They were sent to Pelican Bay, to the security housing unit, where they'd spend the rest of their lives in isolation. No warning, no appeals, just a knock on the cell door at 4 a.m. and a pair of handcuffs. Tommy didn't say goodbye. He didn't look back. He just walked out of San Quentin the same way he'd walked in 41 years earlier. Silent, unbroken. The men who remained felt the shift immediately. The power structure collapsed. The old rules didn't apply. And for a brief, chaotic moment, no one knew who was in charge. Fights broke out. Debts went unpaid. Alliances fractured. The guards went on high alert. Lockdowns became routine. But slowly a new order emerged. Younger men stepped up. The violence didn't stop, but became less organized, less ideological, more desperate. San Quentin was dying, and the men inside could feel it. Marcus Hall was not transferred. He was considered low risk, a model inmate, exactly the kind of man the state wanted to showcase in their new rehabilitation center. He didn't feel like a model. He felt like a prop. The administration started bringing in journalists, filmmakers, politicians. They wanted to document the transformation, show the world that California was leading the way in criminal justice reform. Marcus was asked to participate, to sit in front of a camera and talk about his journey, about redemption, about change. He agreed, not because he believed in the show, but because he thought maybe, just maybe, someone on the outside would hear his story and see him as a person, not a statistic, not a monster, a person. The interview lasted 2 hours. They asked him about his crime, his victims, his remorse, his transformation. He answered every question honestly. He didn't hold back. When it was over, the producer shook his hand and said, "Your story is going to inspire a lot of people." Marcus nodded, but he didn't believe it, because he knew how these stories worked. They'd edit it down to 5 minutes. They'd focus on the redemption arc. They'd make it sound like the system worked, like justice was served, like change was possible. But they wouldn't show the 32 years, the nights he couldn't sleep, the guilt that never left, the fact that no amount of change would bring back the man he killed. They wouldn't show the truth. They'd show the story they wanted to tell. And Marcus would go back to his cell, and nothing would change. James Caldwell got his parole hearing in January 2025. He'd been preparing for months, practicing his statement, gathering letters of recommendation, documenting every program he'd completed. He'd done everything right. The hearing lasted 45 minutes. The board asked him about his crime, his remorse, his plans for re-entry. He answered calmly, honestly. He told them about his daughter, about the job offer he had waiting, about the support system he'd built. The board thanked him for his time, told him he'd receive their decision in writing within 2 weeks. James walked back to his cell and prayed. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. Denied. The board found him unsuitable for parole. They cited the severity of his original offense. They said he needed more time to demonstrate sustained change. He was given a new hearing date. 3 years from now. James didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat on his bunk and stared at the wall, because he'd done everything they asked, and it still wasn't enough. And he realized in that moment that it never would be. By mid-2025, San Quentin's population had been cut by nearly half. The remaining inmates were moved into renovated housing units. The old cell blocks were sealed off. The yard was redesigned. New programs were launched. The prison had a new name, a new mission, a new paint job. But the men inside knew the truth. You can change the name. You can change the policies. You can change the rhetoric. But you can't change the fact that a cage is still a cage. And the men inside were still prisoners. On February 9th, 2026, a journalist stood outside the gates of what was now officially called the San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. Behind her, the sun was setting over the bay. The walls glowed orange in the fading light. She spoke into the camera. This facility, once known as California's most notorious prison, is now a symbol of hope and reform. A place where men are given a second chance, where rehabilitation is prioritized over punishment, where change is possible. Inside, Marcus Hall sat in his cell. He could hear the journalist's voice echoing faintly through the open window. He didn't feel hope. He didn't feel reformed. He felt the same way he'd felt for 32 years, like a man serving a life sentence in a place that promised change but delivered only time. The sun set. The lights came on. The doors locked. And San Quentin, no matter what they called it, remained what it had always been, a place where men were sent to disappear.